we go. Try again. In 1980, Frank Abagnale Jr. wrote a semi-autobiographical book about his life so far. A life full of incredible con artistry, deceit, and forgery. The book, called Catch Me If You Can, was then turned into a movie in 2002, and Abagnale was played by Leonardo DiCaprio, and Tom Hanks played the role of an FBI agent who was tasked with trying to catch him. In both the book and the movie, Frank is portrayed as this cunning, sly, charismatic type of con artist who, with his good looks and easy smile, was able to talk his way into and out of all kinds of crazy situations and talk his way into all kinds of prestigious jobs. With no real credentials whatsoever, Frank writes that he worked his way into a job as the Assistant State Attorney General in the state of Louisiana. At one point, he is named the interim head of a hospital while pretending to be a physician. But his longest con was claiming to be a Pan Am pilot, which allowed him to log over 2 million miles on a plane for free while pretending to deadhead from one city to another or one country to another as a pilot. In addition to faking these high-profile jobs, the thing that eventually ended his fantastical run was that he was also forging high-profile checks. He was able to recreate the look and feel of a Pan Am paycheck and successfully cash over $2.5 million worth of fraudulent paychecks from Pan Am Airlines. In essence, for many years, Frank Abagnale Jr. lived a life of luxury for free. Flying all over the world, nice hotels, fancy meals, the prestige that comes with the title of Attorney General or head of the hospital. He lived this life of luxury, really, while taking credit for things he had never done. In the book of Daniel, we are studying through, we are introduced in Daniel chapter 1 to the great King Nebuchadnezzar. We've been studying through the book of Daniel starting a few weeks ago in a series that we're calling Living with Lions, which has a couple of different meanings that we're going to get to eventually. But here so far, we're into Daniel chapter 5 this morning. So if you're going to follow along with us as we read, flip over to Daniel chapter 5 as we kind of recap here at the beginning. And in Daniel chapter 1, we are introduced to this name that's going to echo through the first 4, even 5 chapters of this book, and that is King Nebuchadnezzar. The first time we see King Nebuchadnezzar, his army, arguably the most powerful army in the world at this time, is besieging Jerusalem in an attempt to take it over. And we're told in Daniel 1:1 that the Lord delivered the king of Judah into Nebuchadnezzar's hand. So let's make sure we've caught the significance of that as we head into what we're going to talk about today. The most powerful army in the world is surrounding the city of Jerusalem and essentially cutting them off from the outside world. And basically, instead of telling us that Nebuchadnezzar overpowered Jerusalem or that they gave up and they submitted, we're told that the Lord turned them over to King Nebuchadnezzar. And this is a thought here. This is a thing that happens in Daniel chapter 1 that Nebuchadnezzar is going to struggle with throughout the rest of his reign. You see, there are kings that are obsessed with their power and prestige. There are kings that are obsessed with their image. And then there's King Nebuchadnezzar. The king that in Daniel 3 builds a 90-foot tall statue of himself made of pure gold. I mean, that takes a certain level of ego, right? And not only does he build this giant tower that represents himself, he says that when they hear certain music that everyone is to bow down and pay worship to him. And if they don't, they get tossed into a fiery furnace. This is the same Nebuchadnezzar who, with all of these incredible building projects that we've read about so far, stamped an inscription to him and his glory on every brick that made up the giant kingdom of Babylon. It would seem that Nebuchadnezzar was pretty proud of himself, proud of the kind of things that he'd done, enamored with his accomplishments. You might even say he was thrilled with the work of his own hands. There's only one problem with that assessment, though, and that's that we read in Daniel chapter 1, verse 1, that there's somebody else who takes at least partial credit for what is happening in Nebuchadnezzar's life. There's somebody else who can lay claim to some of the things that he has done. Last week we dug into Daniel chapter 4. And in Daniel chapter 4, Nebuchadnezzar has this second dream that he needs help interpreting. And before we jump into chapter 5, it would behoove us to go back and look at chapter 4 again, refamiliarize ourselves with what's happening there, because chapter 4 is going to tie pretty closely into chapter 5 here. So in verse 4 of chapter 4, Nebuchadnezzar begins, I, Nebuchadnezzar, was at home in my palace, contented and prosperous, and I had a dream that made me afraid. The dream that Nebuchadnezzar relays to Daniel involves this giant tree with huge stately branches that stretches up into the sky and can be seen all throughout the world. This tree provides fruit for people and animals and shade and shelter for those living underneath it. Suddenly a messenger appears and orders that the animals be scattered and that the tree be chopped down. You are that tree, Daniel says to Nebuchadnezzar. He says, oh boy, I really wish, Nebuchadnezzar, that this dream applied to somebody else and not you. But this is you. This is your kingdom. Nebuchadnezzar's kingdom has grown so big and so broad. Its dominion extends to distant parts of the earth. And Daniel says it's about to be cut down. And not only will Nebuchadnezzar's kingdom be cut down for a while, but Nebuchadnezzar will be tossed out into the fields to wander around and graze like an ox. But Daniel's interpretation ends with this moment of hope. It doesn't have to end this way, Daniel says. It doesn't have to come to this. You don't have to be cut down. You don't have to go spend time out in the woods. You can avoid this fate. All you have to do is do right by the oppressed, to humble yourself a little bit, to recognize what God is doing in your life, and all of this can be avoided. Does Nebuchadnezzar heed this advice? Does Nebuchadnezzar change the way he treats the oppressed? Does he recognize the hand of God at work in the world around him? Short answer, no. All this happened to King Nebuchadnezzar. 12 months later, as the king was walking on the roof of the royal palace of Babylon, he said, "Is this not the great Babylon that I have built as the royal residence by my mighty power and for the glory of my majesty?" And even as the words were on his lips, a voice came from heaven. "This is what is decreed for you, King Nebuchadnezzar. Your royal authority has been taken from you." So as we showed some pictures of last week, this incredible kingdom, Nebuchadnezzar steps out and he looks over all of it and he just can't help it. He says, "This is pretty amazing. Look at what I've done. Look at what I've built." And then the line that probably got him in the most trouble, he says, "Look at what I've built for the glory of my majesty." King Nebuchadnezzar puts his name in the place that God's name should be. He puts himself on the pedestal and even ordered that worship be paid to him. He imagined himself as this giant tree that provides nutrients and shelter for all of these people. And so what was his punishment? He would live in the wilderness. He would graze in the grass like an animal. And what was the translation of that? That he would learn where his provision really comes from. He would learn who it was that really is that tree, and who it is that really gives fruit and shade and shelter to those around him. He would recognize the hand of God at work. Do you remember a few weeks ago, we talked about Daniel chapter 1 and some of the things that Nebuchadnezzar did when he took over Jerusalem. And earlier in this message, we talked about some of the egotistical things that Nebuchadnezzar has done in his time as king, such as the giant statue and the imprinted name on all the bricks and all of that. But there's one we didn't talk about today. And that is that in Daniel chapter 1, we're told that when Nebuchadnezzar overtakes Jerusalem, he goes to the temple and he takes the holy things of God's temple and he stashes them in the temples to his gods. Those we're told he carried off and he stashed them. He's going to hold them in the temples of his gods. Now at this point, you might be saying, I thought we were talking about Daniel chapter 5 and all we've done so far is talk about chapter 4. Well, hang tight because here we go. You see, there's a theme appearing here. There's a theme that shows up in Daniel chapter 4, and it's going to reappear here in chapter 5. In fact, the apple does not fall far from the proverbial dream tree, and the apple does not fall far from the Father to the Son. because Nebuchadnezzar's son is about to take over in Daniel chapter 5. Nebuchadnezzar takes these articles, we're told, and he stashes them in the treasure houses of his God. We mentioned that this is a deeply symbolic thing to do. So ancients believed that the gods controlled the battles, and that while they were battling, the gods were battling. And so if we won, that means that our God is more powerful than your God. And so now we're going to go into your temple, and we're going to take your holy things, and we're going to bring them in, and we're essentially going to stash them underneath the sink in the bathroom of our God. So, spoils of war, right? Our God is stronger than yours, and so now we get to keep your holy stuff. So because we have conquered you, right, then our God has conquered your God. And so there they sat, housed in these storehouses, until King Belshazzar comes along in Daniel chapter 5. And we'll start there in Daniel 5, verses 1 and 2. King Belshazzar gave a great banquet for 1,000 of his nobles and drank wine with them. While Belshazzar was drinking his wine, he gave orders to bring the gold and silver goblets that Nebuchadnezzar, his father, had taken from the temple in Jerusalem, so that the king and his nobles and his wives and his concubines might drink from them. So, there are a few lessons to be learned in life, right? We should, in theory, be able to learn from the mistakes of others, especially those who are close to us, and avoid those same mistakes. Unfortunately, it doesn't work that often for us, and it did not work for Belshazzar either. This lesson, this incredible thing that his father went through when he was deposed and tossed out into the wilderness, that he writes this incredible letter in Daniel chapter 4 about how much it changed him and all of this sort of thing. Does Belshazzar learn from that? No, apparently not. So what he does here, in fact, he's going to take the disrespect that Nebuchadnezzar began with, and he's going to take it up a step further. Instead of just keeping the holy items conquered, he's going to bust them out, and he's going to party with them. Let's drink wine out of the goblets of the Lord's temple. Let's really rub it in. In fact, it's going to get worse, because he's not just going to party with them. We'll keep going. Verses 3 and 4. So they brought the gold goblets that had been taken from the temple of God in Jerusalem, and the king and his nobles, his wives and his concubines drank from them. As they drank the wine, they praised the gods of gold and silver, of bronze, iron, wood, and stone. Okay. I mean, the disrespect of just bringing out the holy articles and partying with them is one thing. But then to bring them out, party with them, and while you're doing so, praise the gods of these inanimate objects while you're partying with the holy items of God. I mean, we don't have to be biblical scholars to read this and go, this is not going to turn out well. Somebody's going to have something to say about what's happening here. Suddenly, the fingers of a human hand appeared and wrote on the plaster of the wall near the lampstand in the royal palace. The king watched the hand as it wrote. His face turned pale, and he was so frightened that his legs became weak and his knees were knocking. And this is scary movie stuff right here, right? I mean, this is like Halloween movie type of things here. We're sitting around at this party and we're having a good time, and then all of a sudden, a detached hand just like rises up and appears and starts writing on the wall. And we're told that Belshazzar watches this happen and that he becomes pale and his knees start knocking. I mean, yeah, wouldn't yours? I mean, I may not even have seen that, because once the hand rose up, I probably just would have fallen flat on the floor, right? And so he's obviously afraid. What is happening here? In the ancient East, they were familiar with this symbol. The detached hand was a symbol that meant something to them. Much like here in our country in these days, if you put a bald eagle on something, that means something. We know what that means. If you put a cross on something, we recognize that as a symbol. And so the detached hand was something that they knew and recognized. And so this detached hand is representative of a fallen enemy. So here, as they drink wine from the temple spoils, the representation of a fallen enemy comes to life and writes 4 words on the plaster wall. Mene, mene, tekel, parsin. Belshazzar is terrified. He is in shock. He's about to pass out. He has no idea what the words are referring to. Now, what's interesting is that they are words that he recognizes. They are words that he knows. They are common Babylonian measurements of weight. So it's as if some hand showed up and wrote on the wall, ounces, ounces, pounds, and tons. You go, okay, I know what those mean, but why are they on the wall? And why is a detached hand writing them right now? So he looks at these words, he recognizes them, but what do they mean? He calls in his magicians and his wise men, and they can't figure it out either. Finally, the queen overhears what's happening and enters the room with a suggestion. And here is yet another lesson that somehow failed to be passed down from one generation to the next, because after all of this dream interpretation that Daniel's been doing so far, Belshazzar has no idea what we're going to do. And the queen walks in and says, hey, we know somebody who can do this. We have somebody who can probably tell us what this means. His name is Daniel. He's pretty good at this stuff. So Daniel comes in, and to Daniel, Belshazzar promises glory, honor, power, if he can provide an interpretation. And Daniel says, I really don't care about all that, but here's what it means. And let's read beginning in verse 18. Your Majesty, the Most High God gave your father Nebuchadnezzar sovereignty and greatness and glory and splendor. Because of the high position he gave him, all the nations and peoples of every language dreaded and feared him. Those the king wanted to put to death, he put to death. Those he wanted to spare, he spared. Those he wanted to promote, he promoted. And those he wanted to humble, he humbled. But when his heart became arrogant and hardened with pride, he was deposed from his royal throne and stripped of his glory. He was driven away from people and given the mind of an animal. He lived with the wild donkeys and ate grass like the ox, and his body was drenched with the dew of heaven, until he acknowledged that the Most High God is sovereign over all kingdoms of the earth and sets over them anyone that he wishes. But you, Belshazzar, his son, have not humbled yourself, though you knew all of this. Instead, you have set yourself up against the Lord of heaven. You had the goblets from his temple brought to you, and your nobles and your wives and your concubines drank wine from them. You praised the gods of silver and gold, of bronze, iron, wood, and stone, which cannot see or hear or understand. But you did not honor the God who holds in his hand your life and all your ways. Therefore he sent the hand that wrote the inscription. This is the inscription that was written. Mene, mene, tekel, parsin. And here's what these words mean. Mene, God has numbered the days of your reign and brought it to an end. Tekel, you have been weighed on the scales and found wanting. Peres, your kingdom is divided and given to the Medes and the Persians. Then at Belshazzar's command, Daniel was clothed in purple, a gold chain was placed around his neck, and he was proclaimed the third highest ruler in the kingdom. And that very night, Belshazzar, king of the Babylonians, was slain, and Darius the Mede took over the kingdom at the age of 62. To many different people, Frank Abagnale Jr. looked like an airline pilot. He talked like an airline pilot, but underneath that fake uniform, he had no idea how to fly a plane. Frank Abagnale Jr. may have looked like a doctor. He might have talked like a doctor. He might have walked like a doctor, but he didn't know the first thing about surgery. Frank Abagnale Jr. was claiming to be something that he was not and had never been. As it turns out, the ruse might even go further than that, because after the writing of this book and the success of the movie, several journalists have tried to go back and verify these audacious claims of all of the fraud that he committed, and turns out the biggest fraud might have been the book in the first place. Nobody's been able to substantiate any of it. He owns a pretty high-profile consulting firm and has made a lot of money off of this book, to the point that he had to come out with a statement a few years ago admitting that some parts of the story might have been exaggerated. Mene, mene, tekel, parsin. You have been weighed on the scales, and you have been found wanting. This idea, as a reference to the marketplace, where vendors would, of course, sell certain goods by weight. So you would go to the marketplace and you would go over to the guy who sells flour, and you would buy a pound of flour, and you would watch as he weighed it on the scale. Says a pound, he bags it up and hands it to you. But you get home and you start to think, I don't know, this doesn't quite feel like a pound. And then you put it on your scale and you realize that that person is operating with dishonest scales. There's specific biblical laws against this because it's something that happened. The bag of flour that claims to be a pound is not. It's not what it claims to be. It has been placed on the scales. It has been weighed. And it has been found wanting. There's a moment in the book that Frank Abagnale writes that we don't know if it's true or not. But in the story, he writes that as the head of hospital, as he's a doctor, he's kind of faking his way through this appointment, and everything's going pretty well so far. In the guise of being a teacher as the head of the hospital, when they ask him to do something, he just asks other people to see if they can do it, and he watches them do it, which works well and fine for a while until the hospital is particularly slammed one night and someone brings in a baby that's turning blue. And everybody else is covered up, and they said, well, that's okay because the head of the hospital is here. And he walks in and has no idea what to do. He has no idea what to say. Thankfully, somebody else saw his hesitation. One of the nurses stepped in and did something and saved the baby's life. But from that point forward, he was not able to pretend to be the head of the hospital anymore because people kept looking at him funny. You should have known what to do right there. If you're the head of the hospital, you should have jumped at that. You should have been there. You should have done that. When you set yourself up in places that you don't belong, you get found out at some point. When you pretend to be something that you're not, you will get found out. Both King Nebuchadnezzar and King Belshazzar are having trouble being honest about who they are and being honest about what they've done and being honest about their role in the world. In fact, Daniel looks at Belshazzar and says, you set yourself up against God. What did you think was going to happen here? You can't set yourself up against God and expect not to be found out. They've been acting as if they are gods, as if they provide for the kingdom, as if they've claimed victory over the Lord and they get to celebrate with the gods of silver and gold. And the whole time, they've failed to acknowledge the hand of God at work in their lives. And so, literally, the hand of God shows up and says, hi, remember me. Here I am. I'm doing something here. And it can be so easy, I think, to go through our daily lives and to try to inadvertently remove God from the equation. To think that we're in control of what's happening here, or to think that we can, by our own willpower, make things happen and be and do. But a life devoid of the presence of God, a life lived without the acknowledgement of who God is and what he's doing around us, is frankly an equation that just doesn't add up. It would be placed on the scales and it would be found wanting. In Daniel chapter 1, we talked about this idea that the entire book of Daniel begins with this terrible situation, this terrible, awful situation where Jerusalem is being tossed back and forth between these powerful worldly kingdoms, and then now Babylon is besieging them and they're starving them to death, and they are overtaken, and the holy articles are taken from Jerusalem and placed in the storehouses of other gods, and the best and the brightest people in all of Jerusalem are captured, and they're taken to Babylon, and they're trained to be Babylonians. I mean, if you're a Jerusalemite, how much worse can this get? And that's the very beginning of the book of Daniel. And we talked about how from this point forward we can gather that God is not done working. In fact, the story of Daniel is just starting. God has not quit because Jerusalem is besieged. God is still working in and through Jerusalem and in and through the lives of those people. And we see that again right here. As the holy articles are taken out and put on display, God says, you don't get to do that. You have them for now, but I'm not done. This is not over. God was not done. God is still working. And so my prayer for us as we reflect on Daniel chapter 5, and we look at the ghost hand that appears and writes on the wall, is that we would open our eyes to see the way that God is working in the world around us. That it wouldn't take a detached hand to show up and say, I'm God, and even though this looks bleak, I'm not done. I'm still working. I am still doing. So, our charge this morning, may we leave this place and go out into the world and intentionally seek the hand of God. Look and pay attention and see if we can recognize the ways in which God is working in our lives, because the biggest takeaway so far is that he absolutely still is. So would you stand with me this morning, and Josh will lead us in one more song, and if I can pray for you this morning, I'd be happy to if you meet me down front. Josh.